Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the hardest games of all time. This time we're looking at 15 of the hardest SNES games of all time. Quote unquote. When it comes to the hardest SNES games of all time, these 15 can't be beat. Yeah, I beg to differ on that. And this was done, 3 days ago. So, let's get into it, shall we? In their move from the NES to the SNES, Nintendo and its development partners often relied on using 8-bit games as the basis for 16-bit innovations. While that approach helped move us toward the future of gaming, it also meant that many SNES games felt spiritually similar to NES titles. That also means that many SNES games retain that arcade-like difficulty that would, in some ways, define over a decade of gaming. While the average SNES game didn't feature nearly as many of the technical and design hurdles that contributed to some of the most difficult NES games ever made, the console is still the proud home of some of the most enjoyable challenges in video game history. Whether you fondly remember them when you look back on this era, or whether they become the star of your worst gaming nightmares, these are the 15 quote-unquote hardest SNES games ever made. Alright, starting with 15. The Lion King. Much like how Disney tucked Mufasa's devastating death scene into a children's movie, the SNES version of The Lion King lures you in with the promise of a whimsical adventure and then stabs you in the back as soon as you let your guard down. The Lion King starts off easy enough, at least relative to other games of this era, and even impresses with its colorful visuals and surprisingly faithful soundtrack. However, most new levels introduce a vicious spike in difficulty that will undoubtedly leave you wondering why you suddenly suck. Then, about halfway through, you're blindsided by an escape level that's arguably as challenging as the speeder bike segment in Battletoads due to its use of both front and rear threats rendered in not quite ready 3D technology that makes controls frustratingly unresponsive. While the latter half of the game steps off the gas just a bit, the Lion King's challenge roadblocks ensure most young gamers never made that far. Okay, you know what? I've never played this. But I know another game that plays just like this, and it's called Mickey Mania, The Timeless Adventures of Mickey Mouse. And I've never played that either, but I know it has a bit of a challenge, but nothing like it's so hard you can't beat it, you know? I mean, there's a difference of how this game works and how this game doesn't work. This is one of those games that, in a sense, is similar to another game. I mean, let's face it. This game went through a transition. You went from a tiny cub to an adult. That doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, there are other games from Disney that were just as hard, but not overtly difficult to play. The Lion King is one of those games that requires a tiny bit of muscle memory in certain spots. But the one thing that differs is how the final boss is. If you've ever remembered The Lion King, and how Scar passed away, it also has a way to echo itself, like in Disney's Tarzan or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm not going to go into it, but you know how it is. I have played very few Disney games in my lifetime as a gamer. And the only ones I've ever played were, the earlier forms when Capcom and Disney were partnered together for certain games like Tailspin, The Little Mermaid, DuckTales, Darkwing Duck. Those were the only games I've ever actually played coming from Disney. I've never played a game like this. And I don't see myself playing something like this in the near future. So moving on from number 15 to... Why are you here? Number 14. Cho Makaimura. Otherwise known as Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Why are you here? It's amazing that Super Ghouls and Ghosts is at least as difficult as its predecessor, considering that its controls are vastly improved and the action is significantly smoother overall. Yeah, but guess what you still gotta do? You still have to do the following. You have to beat the game twice. One to say you've beaten it, and the second to say, oh, you need the guy's bracelet. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to state this once. I'm going to state this twice. I prefer Gargoyle's Quest over this. The only game that I ever played out of this series is Demon's Crest, which is the last of the Gargoyle's Quest series. I prefer that over Dai Makamoto. However, it appears that Capcom felt that Super Ghouls and Ghosts was much more playable than Ghosts and Goblins on NES. That meant that they could make the game noticeably more difficult. The sequel features more on-screen enemies and more environmental hazards, but the same iconic health system that essentially leaves you with a razor-thin margin for error that might as well be non-existent due to how difficult it is to progress after a single hit. While this game's hard mode may be the most difficult challenge on the SNES, I'll split the difference slightly and rightfully refer to the title's normal mode as one of the most punishing experiences in the history of Nintendo consoles. No matter what game it is, if it's Makaimura or Ghouls and Ghosts, no matter what they call it, it is still a pain in the ass. Enough said. Okay, next one. Why the fuck are you still here? Number 13. Battle Maniacs. I'm not going to call it Battletoads and Battle Maniacs. It's just what it is. Battle Maniacs. Truth be told, I debated whether or not to include Battle Maniacs, given that the Truth be told, I debated whether or not to include Battle Maniacs, given that the game is probably slightly easier than the original on the NES. At the very least, it repeats a lot of the original's best tricks. However, familiarity does little to diminish just how difficult this game truly is. Once again, the highlight of this game's difficulty is the various vehicle sections that require you to avoid various obstacles while moving at high speeds. The infamous speeder bike section in the sequel is as hard as it ever was, but I have to give a special shout out to that vertical scroller level that requires you to maneuver between wall spikes that force you into a safe zone that's only about as wide as your character. Yeah, again, I'm going to say this again. Why are you here? It is not hard. No, hard does not begin. Hard is not the word for a game like Battletoads. Especially, I should say, the console version of Battletoads. I feel the only version that is actually playable on any version would be Battletoads Double Dragon The Ultimate Team. That is a better game, even though it's a crossover with two franchises coming from Tradewest and Technos at the time. And it was done better because at least when you got to the speeder bike section, it wasn't like ridiculously fast. It wasn't at ludicrous speed. No, it wasn't anything of that nature. But I still would not touch this game. I played it before. It's if it was more akin to the arcade version, which it was to some degree. If it played more like the arcade version, in which the arcade version never had a speeder bike section. It had a space cruiser shoot 'em up section. I would be okay with that. I would be okay if Battle Maniacs played more like Battletoads Arcade. If it did, I'd be fine with it. Otherwise, yeah, I'd say nope. Nope and fuck no. I'd consider this the best way to experience Battletoads due to its visual and control improvements, but the game is so difficult that it rides that line between being addictively challenging and frustratingly cruel. Got that right. Number 12. Bart's Nightmare. Yes, Bart's Nightmare is a pretty bad game that suffers from some often awful controls, but it would likely still be remembered as one of the most frustrating SNES games ever made, even if it was a bit more refined. Essentially, a collection of minigame levels, Bart's Nightmare forces you to quickly master a series of entirely new scenarios with their own rules. Now, that's annoying, but what makes this game so noteworthy is that some of their individual levels in this game are so mechanically challenging as they are conceptually confusing. There's no better example of those concepts than the game's Indiana Jones tribute level, a bewildering collection of platforms and traps that would still be difficult to figure out even if things weren't constantly trying to kill you. This is one of the SNES best examples of a game that lures you in with a familiar name and then compensates for a relatively short amount of content by making everything as hard as possible. Okay, with this one I can say, you think that's bad, play Virtual Bart. That's even worse than Bart's Nightmare. Because really, The Simpsons never really had a good game past the arcade game. And the arcade game was so very enjoyable because you can play as all the Simpsons. Homer, Marge, Bart, and Lisa. This being brought by Acclaim has been nothing more than a cash grab of sorts. Because prior to that, there was Bart versus the Space Mutants, Bart and Radioactive Man, Bart versus the World. They all have one thing in common, and as the difficulty is cheap as all get out. I mean, what would you expect from something that came from this franchise? It was cheap. It's like, okay, you ever played a Simpsons game, no matter what console it was, they all ended up being the same damn thing. Redundantly cheap. And I would say the hitbox is real suspect. I mean, totally. I would never touch a Simpsons game outside of Konami's arcade game, due to the fact that there hasn't been a good one since. And I can say that after getting past the NES, SNES, Genesis, and Game Boy games, they eventually got better. So if you really want to just go after a Simpsons game, go after one of the better ones. The ones that would make a lot more sense to play. And a lot more enjoyable too, in my humble opinion. Moving on. Number 11. Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest. Growing up, I don't really remember hearing many kids talk about how hard the Donkey Kong Country series is. It wasn't until years later I really started to see more people give this franchise the respect it deserves as the home of some of the most infuriating platformers ever crafted. My friend, I will say, you talk to a man named 40 Warrior, he'll set your ass straight. He's done a Let's Play of it. DKC2 is the arguable apex of this franchise's difficulty curve. Once again, the problem here is the variety of the game's stages. Even if you are able to keep up with a series of certainly creative new challenges, you'll eventually encounter a new stage that uses an old mechanic but makes things roughly twice as difficult as before. To make matters worse, the mechanics are spaced out in such a way that you basically need to relearn them while battling a much more difficult version of the concept. The good news is that DKC2 is actually a genuinely well-designed game that encourages you to keep trying, even as it mercilessly forces you to doubt your abilities. Again, I'm giving 40 his props because I actually seen his Let's Play of DKC2. And he made it seem like it was nothing. So don't tell me that's hard. If one person out of our little piddly ass gaming group could actually whip the ass of DKC or Mega Man or even Final Fantasy, then we got a 3-up on the competition right there. Okay? Number 10, Earthworm Gen 2. While the original Earthworm Gen is difficult, not even that game can prepare you for how unforgiving Earthworm Gen 2 truly is. If Earthworm Gen 2 only consisted of its side-scrolling stages, it would still be in the running as one of the harder SNES titles. However, we once again encounter a Battletoad scenario where the game's special vehicle and race sections raise the overall difficulty to such a degree that I honestly can't say I've ever spoken to anyone who managed to beat this game as a kid or adult without at least relying on emulator save scumming. Sir! Oh, and the fact that some of this game's most infuriating levels also see you quite literally let puppies down every time you fail is an exercise in pure cruelty. Okay, first off, let me just say this. I play with emulators. And I can only say this. Save states are your friends. They are your best friends in the entire world of gaming. And secondly, I played a bit of Earthworm Gen 2 back in the day. It is not as bad as one thinks. It just requires some muscle memory guarding the races. Because if you know how to avoid everything, just pretend you're playing Sonic 2. And the only thing you had to do was get through the bonus stage and get the Chaos Emeralds. But in order to get the Chaos Emeralds, you must pick up a certain number of rings per lap. And you must also have to avoid getting hit by bombs or spikes. You have to avoid getting hit by any sort of obstacles that should stop you from getting the number of rings you're allowed to get per lap in order to get the Chaos Emerald at each end of the special stage. It takes trial and error, but it is not as bad as one would think. I mean, Earthworm Gen 2 is somewhat difficult. Excuse me. It is somewhat difficult, but however, it is not like, oh my god, it's so hard. It really isn't. It really isn't as hard as one would think it is. Number 9. Moving on. Jurassic Park. During the 8 and 16-bit eras, it was relatively easy to buy into the idea that a game was simply impossible. While that distinction was sometimes afforded to action titles that demanded perfect reflexes and pattern recognition, you more often heard it used to describe titles of that era that left you wondering, where am I going and what am I supposed to do? Few games of that mold are more memorable than Jurassic Park. What starts off as a seemingly simple top-down action game quickly reveals itself to be a labyrinth of puzzles, awkward first-person segments, and enemies that can kill you before you have a chance of figuring out where you're supposed to go next. Honestly, it reminds me a little of the notoriously difficult Fester's Quest for the NES. What's worse is that there are no save points or passwords, which means that you've got to beat the whole thing in one lengthy sitting. I'm actually a little impressed that this much creativity went into a relatively early licensed game, but Jurassic Park is a prime example of the kind of game that essentially demands a walkthrough, as even figuring out which direction you're supposed to walk in is often unintuitive. Okay, first off, I'm one of the few people out there that actually did like the SNES version of Jurassic Park. I mean, the way it worked was, yeah, you fought the dinosaurs, but only to do the following. to get their eggs. And what you had to do after that was you had to get key cards in order to get through the buildings. You eventually have to escape the island, of course. But the one thing about Jurassic Park that was so amazingly different from all the other games that had a license to it was that it was never the same. You play the NES version, it sort of played like the SNES version, except that there wasn't anything like what the SNES version had. Or if you have the Genesis, it played differently. Hell, even the Sega CD version of Jurassic Park played a whole lot differently. And let's not forget there was an arcade version of Jurassic Park, which was nothing more than a rail shooter akin to Lucky and Wild. Where one person drives, the other person shoots. Or you did the driving and the shooting. But I think it was just mainly just shooting. It was just rail shooting. Aside from that, Jurassic Park was just different. In any port of that game, it played differently. It never played the same. It just played very much different. That doesn't mean it was difficult. I mean, if you're saying this, you're basically saying, I don't know how to play Jurassic Park. That's like saying you don't know what to do in Sonic the Hedgehog. Or, dare I say, you don't know how to jump in Mario. You don't know how to run fast in Mario. You don't know how to throw a goddamn fireball in Mario. I can also say, you know what that means? Take your ass back to Pac-Man, you little bitch. Moving on. Number 8. I will look at this momentarily in another video, but right now, let's look at number 8. ActRaiser 2. Another game that I actually played, but I really didn't enjoy it as much as the first game. The original ActRaiser was also fairly difficult, but it blends a platforming action and town building. It's so impressive that you kind of forgive it for its difficulty spikes. For ActRaiser 2, developer Quintet seemingly convinced themselves that the reason people love the original was because of its challenging side-scrolling levels rather than its variety. At least that's my best explanation for why they abandoned the town building elements and instead focused on crafting the hardest side-scrolling levels imaginable. Much to the dismay of many young gamers, they accomplished that mission in such a way that it ensures the mere mention of ActRaiser 2 can unlock a treasure trove of repressed gaming memories. Some of the game's challenges are amplified by sluggish controls and animations, but much of the difficulty comes down to the level design. From floating platforms to the pit of depths. ActRaiser 2 is like a hall of fame for every controller breaking concept of its era. The shame of it is that ActRaiser 2 is really just a few tweaks away from being one of the underrated gems of its time. Instead, the game's only notable legacy is the crushing weight of its difficulty and some great art direction. Okay, truth be told, who the fuck actually think that was a good idea? Let's compare ActRaiser with ActRaiser 2. Okay? One thing is, you still played the role of God. Or as it was brought over here, the Master. You still had to save the world from the devil. The only difference was there was town building. And you had to act accordingly as God. So, let us see it like this. We took out the town building in ActRaiser 2. But you were still playing as God. You could actually glide, which you couldn't do in the first game. Okay, one thing I would have done if I was to make a sequel of an already existing game is if a character had some way to get around the stage much more simple and take less time to do, I would say, yeah, you know what? Implement that. Character has wings. Fly. Glide. Float. Double jump. Any which way you can, that's how you work that. You work what the character didn't have in the original and just simplify and just say, okay, guess what? We upgrade the character. We make the character stronger. We make the character faster. We make the character more attuned to what this character should be. Character is an angel, so therefore let us treat him as such. He's a flying character. He's a floating character. That means he can get around certain parts of the stage with little to no problem. However, that's not the case here. But I can't say it's difficult. No, it's not really difficult. Like I said, I played it a bit. I just didn't like it because it lacked the town building. Like, yes, the first game you had town building before and after. And one thing I feel I deem necessary would be if they kept the town building for the second game. Oh, no doubt. I would have enjoyed it a lot better. On top of that, well, you had perks when you were doing town building. That's the one thing that was a thing to me. Like, why would you do that? So why would you take out the perks of a game in which welcome town building, or not just welcome town building, but it gave you perks for actually building a town or destroying it and make it better, you know. Never did understand that. Never did understand that. Moving on. A game I've never actually done, but given time, I might try it for myself. Number 7, the Seven Saga. The SNES is rightfully remembered as the home of some of the best RPGs ever made. Amen. But few of these RPGs are necessarily remembered among the console's most difficult games. That being the case, you may go into a game like the Seven Saga feeling pretty confident. If so, then consider this fair warning that Seven Saga is absolutely one of the hardest 16-bit games ever made. For some reason, this game's developers decided to make the US version of this game even more difficult than it already was. The result is a project with typical RPG challenges that are amplified by the fact that enemies can survive an absurd amount of damage that makes level grinding more important than ever. Sadly, the US version of this game makes leveling even slower than before, which means that already challenging battles feel that much more laborious. The Seven Saga is actually a very good game, but its already challenging puzzles, dungeons, and bosses are made legendary by virtue of one of the most questionable difficulty bumps in gaming history. Okay, first and foremost, there is a thing we have now called patching. I have played a game that did patching. I only have 2 games in my collection that I actually played unpatched. And what I mean by unpatched is, before the game had its little spike. And I bring the attention of one defunct company that I used to keep in contact with during my teenage years. Working Designs. If you know the name Working Designs, their games go up to 11. So, one of the few games that I had, or rather some of the titles that I actually have, they were done in this way. Games like Lunar, Vi, Lunar Eternal Blue, and Pop Full Mail. I think it was more like Eternal Blue, Vi. Oh, I almost forgot. Exile. This can easily be fixed by actually getting this game patched. It's the same thing with Arcana. And I played Arcana with a special patch on just to do the following. Just to make the level grind a lot better because the drop was just too... So I can clearly say that can be fixed. Something like this, given time, you might want to check to see if there's a patch for it. Just to make the game a lot easier to where you can either get more experience or make it a little more balanced. Because that's all the game really just needed. It's the same thing with, say, Bayou Billy. So all you needed to do was the following. Play the original version. Find out it was so much easier than the version we got. Not a problem. Just not a real problem. Oh, this shit. Number 6. Super Star Wars Empire Strikes Back. I actually love the SNES trilogy of Star Wars games and recently wished the developer would revisit their core concepts and update them for modern platforms. If that happens, though, then there's going to be an interesting debate about whether those games should retain the difficulty that has come to define The Empire Strikes Back. Why is it called The Empire Strikes Back? While the other 2 Super Star Wars games are difficult, Empire Strikes Back is on another level. While some of the vehicle stages are annoying, they're not necessarily the reason so many gamers never beat the sequel. That honor instead belongs to the absurd toughness of the average enemy combined with the need to navigate some tricky levels while battling them. How many creatures survive so many blows from a lightsaber? With why is absolutely everything in this galaxy, including wild creatures, so hell-bent on killing our heroes? Empire Strikes Back often avoids feeling cheap or especially cruel, but that's cold comfort for a legion of fans who have never still beaten this game. First off, I can do you one better. The Namco version of Star Wars on the Famicom. Sure, like who hasn't heard of Scorpio Darth Vader? Yes, Scorpio Darth Vader. No one has ever heard of that. That is more difficult than this. But I think people are so damn near stupid that they want to play the game on the hardest difficulty just to prove something. I'm not going to name names because I know somebody who does that sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. But still, he's like a brother to me, so I can't be all that mad about that. That's what he wants to do. That's what he's going to do. Moving on. Like I said, Star Wars. A game like this is like, I don't touch Star Wars really. At one point I did, but you know, the way it is now, especially with copyright, you hear one piece of John Williams' epic music, they'll hit your ass so fast with a copyright claim and make your head spin. So it's not even worth it. Moving on to a game that I personally own, number 5, Contra 3, The Alien Wars, otherwise known as Probotector. Super Probotector. I don't have to tell you that Contra 3 is a hard game. It is, after all, a Contra game, which means that it was designed to be frustrating. Even still, there are reasons why Contra 3 stands out to this day as the hardest game that many of us played growing up. Here again, we have a SNES game where the developers must have thought to themselves, well, if we're giving them better graphics and better control, then we should probably make everything more difficult to compensate for the natural frustration we lost. As such, Contra 3 ups the ante of the franchise by taking what was already a very difficult action experience and adding a variety of expertly placed elemental hazards that keep you constantly off balance. It certainly doesn't help that the bosses are some of the toughest in the series' history, and that the game's top-down segments offer a uniquely challenging break from the standard side-scrolling. I don't know. There was a game called Super C that did that. And prior to that, Contra. This is really just a great action game that just so happens to be maddeningly but appropriately difficult. Okay, first off, I've done this once. But the only way I do this proper is by cheats. Contra 3 is no stretch of the imagination, just as hard as hardcore for the Genesis. But tell me one thing. When was the last time you actually fought a goddamn giant snatcher in a Konami game like that? Truly. I mean, to me, when you say it's hard, I'm like, okay, how is it hard? Hard in what way? I find it to be the most interesting because guess what? You get to dual wield two awesome ass weapons. There have been many other Contra games that have been just as hard, but probably just about the same as every other Contra game before that. You got Neo Contra. You got Shattered Soldier. You have everything past it. You got Hardcore. And really, trust me when I say this, but Contra is what it is. And whether you do it with or without cheats, it goes about saying the same that even if it's hacked, it's still a Contra game by its core. And all you have to do is just notice everything by the book. Okay, you're supposed to jump here, do this. You just have to be careful, that's all. It's frantic. It's supposed to be like that. But if you can handle it, then it should be no problem. Moving on to number 4. A game that I streamed some months back called Hagane Final Conflict. This wasn't especially popular when it was released in 1994. But this is one of those games that was resurrected by the internet. Those who did play it spent years passionately encouraging everyone to revisit this truly overlooked gem. Before you do play this game, though, you need to know that Hagane is almost comically difficult. While Hagane's generous controls and incredible overall design mean that you're not hindered by fundamentally unfair mechanics, the sheer amount of obstacles that this game throws at you will leave you laughing at the game over screen as you try to process what just happened. Imagine Shinobi with even more enemies and environmental hazards. That's the basic Hagane experience. That said, Hagane's incredible controls, lightning speed, and excellent level design make it worth every frustrating moment you encounter along the way. Nah, I do what I'm supposed to do. I cheated. I played this on stream. Like I said, I cheated. Because really, by nature, you're supposed to be a ninja. Ninja are supposed to jump good. The only problem I actually ever found with it was, just trying to platform proper. Otherwise, yeah, it wasn't that bad. It was interesting, but it wasn't that bad. Moving on to another game that I myself rented back in the day, and that game is UN Squadron, aka Area 88. You can't talk about the hardest SNES games without talking about the console's collection of side-scrolling shooters. Which shooter is the hardest, though? Super R-Type? Exile? Actually, I think that honor belongs to Area 88. This often underappreciated game initially impresses with its surprising customization options, but it's perhaps best remembered as a stunningly hard experience. Even though it isn't as cheap as similar SNES games and doesn't suffer from as many slowdown problems, this title compensates for its lack of inherent issues in other ways. Actually, the game's enemies and levels are cleverly designed to quickly produce some of the tightest death zones you'll find in any SNES game. Oh, that's true. Even genre veterans will find themselves sweating during this game's final levels. Don't even get me started on how rough the higher difficulty settings are. I can tell you one thing. You trying to survive by using Shin Kazama or Mickey Simon, that pretty much states it right there. Because there have been times, and especially with cheats, that you really just had to thread the needle. And that game really does that. You really have to thread the needle on that one. No lies. But all in all, I liked it because it was different. It's a game that actually made you sweat. Even with cheats, it still made you sweat. And I've only used cheats just for one reason. Just so I can buy all the ships. And on top of that, just to say I wanted to beat this game. But yes, this right here, this pretty much is the definition of what UN Squadron is. You had to survive off this. Because you take about 4 hits. Think of it as like 1943 refined. And all you had to do is just try to survive. But you had to take like 5 hits. That's how much your plane can take. 5 hits. When it goes from white, green, yellow, red, and black. I've often fought through that game with the warning signal on because I kept getting that. Even with the cheats on. It doesn't make the game any easier. But it makes it easier for me. That's why I say I use cheats. Because I use cheats against the AI. I never use cheats when I'm playing with another person. Because it's just you versus the game. So therefore, if the game doesn't play fair, why should you? You played it by their rules. Now you play by your rules. Number 2. A game in which I've seen Ryu play, and I've frequently played this myself. Number 2 is Zam, or Zombies Ate My Neighbors. At a time when zombie games were still a novelty, which feels like a lifetime ago, Zombies Ate My Neighbors allowed players to test their mettle against an undead horde, while enjoying creative and colorful visuals complemented by a fairly tight control scheme. On the surface, it doesn't seem like it would be one of the hardest SNES titles. From moment to moment, I'm not sure it is. It is. However, Zombies Ate My Neighbors has truly earned that distinction amongst gamers who have actually tried to beat this game. Not only does Zam feature nearly 50 levels, each of which is more difficult than the last, but the game's resource system means that even a minor mistake on a level can make every level that comes afterward even more challenging than it would otherwise be. The constant onslaught of resource-demanding bosses can also easily wear down the patience of even the most composed players. Even amongst the speedrunning community, to which some of the most skilled gamers in the world belong. Yeah, fuck that shit. Zam is considered to be one of the most difficult games ever made from a completionist perspective. If you really think about it, you'll probably realize you never actually made it that far, no matter how much you played it. Or if you really want to try harder, Predator 2. Because it has one thing, these two games have one thing in common. You have to save a certain number of prisoners in order to pass the stage. Or if you can't pass the stage by saving the prisoners, you would have to destroy the boss in order to do that. And the bosses in that game were just nuts. What other game has you fight a giant baby as a boss? I mean, a game is long enough. A game is long enough as is. It almost reminds me of Soldiers of Fortune or the Chaos Engine. Take your pick. In some way, but still. It's a game that will try you. That much can be said. This game will try you. But I wouldn't go so far as say, speedrun community, because you know what? None of them are perfect. None of them are perfect. And, of course, I personally do not care much for speedrunning. And the number one game that I also have in my library that I've played before. Castlevania Dracula X, or otherwise known as Dracula X. With Super Castlevania 4, Konami dialed things back a bit by granting the player more control over their character. The game was still difficult, but the fact that it allowed you to do things such as swing your whip in any direction made it more accessible than anything that came before. Castlevania Dracula X, on the other hand, throws all that out the window and replaces those expanded controls with more environmental hazards than ever before. Considered to be the true successor to Castlevania 3 due to its ritual controls and design, Dracula X can also be considered the hardest game in the franchise, synonymous with difficulty. There's almost no margin for error in this action title, as nearly every jump and swing can end your run if they're not executed properly. Actually, there's more to that. The cherry on top of this one is a final boss against Dracula that forces you to jump across tiny platforms as you try to beat what would already be a difficult boss even without the gimmick. It's an appropriate nightmare of a gaming experience. Actually, yeah. But the only way I felt that what you could do, besides what I would think would make a lot of sense, besides using cheats, is knowing where he's gonna stand. Plus, you have a character that can do a backflip. Not a double jump, but a fucking backflip. Like, seriously. Richter Belmont had the most interesting moveset of them all because he had a backflip. He actually had a jump that actually was worth something. He was still slow as shit, just like every other Belmont before him, but he could actually jump really good. Unlike all the other Belmonts that had a problem with jumpings. And those past that, the only problem I found was that Richter could only do a backflip. And if you didn't know how to master the backflip, it will bite you in the ass. Straight up. Now, my end result of this is, I can say, it's the following. Dracula X can only be sizably hard if you don't do the following. You don't save Annette or Maria. Because versus Rondo of Blood, you actually have the chance to do the following, which is save every single maiden that was held by Dracula. Here in Dracula X, you only have 2. And you can easily miss 1 by not having one little item. That's the key. So it's very easy to really mess up if you didn't know where to go. Therein lies the challenge of that game. Not the platforming, but where to go. And just to hold on to one item to make sure that if you save this one character, that makes your odds a whole lot better because it changes the outcome of the ending. It's a lot like with Mad City, being that, oh, you don't want to deal with Annabelle's bullshit? You don't have to. Just walk away from her. There's your bad ending right there. So once again, this came from Den of Geek, and let me tell you, regarding this list, it's 50-50. 50% right, 50% wrong. But I can truly say that all these games that were mentioned here, they had a respectable challenge. They have a challenge between lines of respectable to what the fuck. That's how the challenge was. It was really like more like that and a little less of that. But aside from that, I don't know if you know any other titles, be it a dishonorable mention. Please let me know in the comments, or put it down in the comments for God's sakes. Let the world know what you think should be on this list or what shouldn't be on this list, and instead figure out what there is that we can learn from this. Me, I just play something that I know I can beat. And just have a cheat on hand just in case things get hairy. So next time, my friends, on the series, we will look at 15 classic Sega Genesis games that are impossible to beat. So stay tuned for more of this series right after this. Thanks so much for watching.